Are you, is it?
Hello? Yeah.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, great. Good evening, everybody. I'm Scott Stiles, and I'm a board member here at ICCR. It's great to welcome you to the first of many seminars and public presentations as we take a stronger role in leading thought on global issues in the Capital District area. It's great to have you here, and we want to present to you today, obviously, the role of diplomacy in rebuilding security in Europe by Dr. Zachary Paikin, Deputy Director of the Better Order Project at the Quincy Institute. However, before we start, we have a little bit of a treat for you this evening. We'd first like you to view a short video, no more than about 2 minutes, on what we do as an organization, as an ICCR, International Center for the Capital Region, to inform you about our mission, our goals, and ways to get involved, ways to contribute to our organization, and also benefit from our organization in the future. Here we go.
At the International Center of the Capital Region, we believe that global connections begin at home. Through our professional exchange programs, we welcome emerging leaders from around the world and foster cross-cultural understanding and collaboration in our community. These face-to-face exchanges are more than just meetings. They are opportunities for us to share knowledge, ideas, and traditions. By opening our doors and hearts, we practice citizen diplomacy, building bridges of friendship, mutual respect, and cooperation that transcend borders. Our work wouldn't be possible without our dedicated volunteer community, people like you who host, mentor, and welcome our visitors. Do you want to leave a lasting, positive impression on visitors to the Albany area? Would you like to share a meal, guide a cultural experience, or offer personal or professional insights into our region? Your role in these exchanges would make a lasting impact on our visitors. If you're interested in making a global impact, join our Citizen Diplomacy Certification Workshop and gain the knowledge and tools to be a Goodwill Ambassador. Learn how to create meaningful connections to shape a more peaceful and prosperous world. By becoming a member, hosting an international guest, or volunteering, donating, or participating in our Citizen Diplomacy Workshop, you can help us fulfill our mission. Every contribution promotes a more connected, understanding, and globally engaged resident of the Capital Region. Join us today and learn more at www.iccralbany.org.
Indeed, join us today. Don't waste any more time. Come and be a part of our family. And if I can ask our executive director, Beth Wales, to stand, and our program director, Holly Planels McKenna, and our board chairperson, Christine Guerin, to stand as well. Without their hard work, tireless minutes and hours and days, this would never have come to fruition. And if you would like to join the organization, please see them. They will have lots of information and make signing up easy for you. Before we go any further, let's take a minute to thank Dr. Jay Deichman at HVCC here for all of his work behind the scenes, getting this wonderful auditorium for us together, the AV department and their hard work with the mics and the staging and the lights. It's truly been a community effort. So without further ado, let me introduce our featured speaker this evening. Dr. Zachary Paikin is Deputy Director of the Better Order Project and also a research fellow in the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a transpartisan action tank and communications project established to challenge the decades-long obsession of U.S. foreign policy decision-makers with global military dominance and war, according to its website. The Institute takes its namesake from our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, who said on July 4th, 1821, 45 years after the founding of the United States of America, quote, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy," unquote. A quote and principle, once again, written broadly and boldly on the Quincy Institute's website. In essence, it's a thoughtful and principled statement of American foreign policy at that time, and perhaps a normative statement as to what we should be doing today, emphasizing restraint and commitment to liberty without interventionism, values that the Quincy Institute upholds and supports in a steadfast manner. Dr. Paikin is also a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, a Canadian international affairs think tank, and was a researcher in EU foreign policy at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and also a senior researcher in the International Security Dialogue program at the Geneva Center for Security Policy from 2023 to 2024. Among other affiliations, Dr. Paikin serves as chair of the Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security and is a collaborator with the Network for Strategic Analysis, funded by the Canadian Department of National Defense. He was also a member of the Cooperative Security Initiative, a project to strengthen East-West cooperation, and served as a speechwriter for Canada's permanent mission to the United Nations as part of the Canadian government's bid for a UN Security Council seat in 2020. Dr. Paikin earned his PhD in international relations from the University of Kent in Canterbury, England, and his research, which focuses on Russian foreign policy, European security, Canadian foreign policy, and international order, has been published by leading think tanks, including the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal United Services Institute, and the London School of Economics. His most recent book, titled Rebooting Global International Society, Change, Contestation, and Resilience, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2022. It's certainly a delight to have Dr. Paikin here to address us and educate us about rebuilding security in Europe and the role of diplomacy. What a fantastic and accomplished and outstanding resume you have, Dr. Paikin. Without further ado, Dr. Zachary Paikin.
Well, many thanks, Scott, for that kind introduction, and allow me to express my gratitude as well to Beth, Holly, Jay, and the entire team at the International Center of the Capital Region for hosting me here today. Along with our CEO, Laura Lumpy, who is also here with us, it's a genuine pleasure to be here today on behalf of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'm here today to discuss the once and future European security order, the complex set of interlocking institutions, norms, principles, expectations, and state-to-state relations that underwrite security and stability on the European continent. Would you prefer if I take off this lapel and hold it closer to my hand? Move away from that. I don't think that's the issue. I think this is off. I think that I should probably just hold this closer to my mouth, if that's okay. The main point that I'd like to convey in my remarks here is that the European security order of the post-Cold War era, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, that order was fundamentally contested. And by that, I mean that Russia and the West had fundamentally different ideas about what sorts of norms, institutions, and principles should underpin security cooperation in Europe. And let me begin by saying that Russia is indeed in Europe. Russia may not be part of the West, which is a political notion dating back to the Cold War era, but it is very much a part of Europe, which is a civilizational notion. After the Cold War, nearly all of Europe transitioned to becoming liberal democratic nation-states and market economies. Russia, which continues in some ways to be structured more like an empire than like a nation-state, had difficulty making that transition. And this made it easier to claim that Russia was alien to Europe, but such claims have been made, indeed, for centuries. And throughout those centuries, especially the 18th and the 19th, Russia was an integral part of the European aristocracy and the European balance of power system. And today, Russia may be deepening its ties with China and positioning itself as a cultural and geopolitical ally of the global South, but Russia's government retains significant security interests in Europe, and its people continue to identify with European culture, both past and present. So Russia may be distinct from the rest of Europe in meaningful ways, but ultimately what this tells us is that Europe's political and cultural landscape is fundamentally pluralistic. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, not only resulted in the largest and ultimately the deadliest war in Europe since World War II, it also marked the death of the post-Cold War European security order. And when it comes to assigning fault for that order's collapse, there is much blame to go around. Russian President Vladimir Putin was ultimately the one who chose to pull the trigger, and for that he has been rightly condemned and opposed. But decisions were made by all sides, by Russia, by the West, and by Ukraine, over a span of 3 decades that tragically, gradually made war in Europe thinkable once again. To understand these decisions and to plan as well for a more secure future for Europe, we need to think holistically, right? As I've already suggested, we need to think of Europe's security order not as a collection of leaders, personalities, and political regimes, but rather as a series of interlocking institutions and principles in which actors of all kinds have a stake. Only then can we understand what went wrong and how we can avoid making the same mistakes again. So first, let's talk about institutions. The fact is that when the Cold War ended, Russia and the West had very different ideas about what institutions should take the lead in providing security for Europe. As early as the George H.W. Bush administration in 1991, the United States had decided that it would remain involved in European security matters despite the end of the Soviet threat, that NATO would be the vehicle for that involvement, and that NATO should also be the supreme security body in Europe. And this decision was only reinforced by events such as the Yugoslav wars, because addressing those conflicts ultimately became the prerogative of institutions that had the necessary capabilities, and quite often that was NATO. The problem, of course, is that NATO was, and NATO is, an institution of which Russia was not a member, nor of which it ever had a realistic chance of becoming a member. And arriving at a consensus position on a given issue among NATO members would sap the energy of member state capitals to a degree that there was no longer any chance of that position changing in subsequent talks with Russia. So in short, the content of NATO-Russia discussions was all too often formal rather than substantial. Whether intentional or not, this led to a situation in which Russia's declared security interests became de facto secondary considerations. NATO may have consulted often with Russia, but whether these consultations had any bearing on NATO's ultimate actions was very much an open question. The fall of the Iron Curtain left Russia eager to return to what it saw as its natural home, indeed its pre-communist home in Europe. Yet as the former American diplomat William Hill, who's a participant in our project, has put it, the continental security order that emerged out of the Cold War's ashes left no place for Russia. Russia's vision of European security was very different from the Western one. Moscow's preference was for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, to become Europe's preeminent security body rather than NATO. And unlike in NATO, Russia had a seat at the table in the OSCE. And given that decisions at the OSCE are taken by unanimous consensus, Russia also held a veto there. However, as the post-Cold War era went on, it became clear that the OSCE was not like its Cold War era predecessor, the CSCE. During the Cold War, membership of the CSCE, which included virtually all countries situated between Vancouver and Vladivostok, was split roughly evenly between NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and neutral countries such as Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Austria, and Yugoslavia. But after the Cold War, the overwhelming majority of these countries became either members of NATO and the EU or aspiring members of NATO and the EU who would want to align themselves with NATO and EU foreign policy. Moscow, therefore, found itself increasingly outvoted at the OSCE. And at the same time as this was going on, the OSCE's focus shifted increasingly over the course of the post-Cold War era toward observing elections, promoting media freedom, and securing minority rights. And the growing perception, therefore, was that the OSCE was an institution responsible for second-tier issues and whose purpose was to lecture second-tier countries in Eastern Europe. This was, of course, a far cry from Russia's vision of an inclusive forum capable of superseding the Cold War era's two military blocs and addressing the most pressing geopolitical issues of the day. And as the enlargement of the European Union took root as well, even the question of economic cooperation on the continent ceased to be a matter of East-West equality. Rather, the paradigm became that Brussels bureaucracy would be the rule maker and non-EU members would be the rule takers. So clearly, both sides were speaking very different languages during this period. Russia wanted to ensure that it had a seat at the table where conflicting interests could be adjudicated and common interests pursued. From its point of view, neither geopolitical bloc had won the Cold War. Rather, Moscow had decided to jettison a failing communist system of its own volition and abandon, for idealistic reasons, a decades-long superpower standoff that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev believed was bringing humanity to the brink of nuclear war. By contrast, and this is the narrative that we all grew up with here in the West, Western powers believed that the end of the Cold War represented the vindication of Western liberal democracy. And the common wisdom at the time was that Russia would either Westernize and thereby abandon its status as an independent great power with its own unique set of interests, or it would continue to sink into irrelevance as an increasingly weak and dysfunctional state. And therefore, from the Western perspective, there seemed to be little need to treat Russia as a fully fledged peer. Unfortunately, as a result, what we ended up with was an increasingly hostile and spurned Russia that remained strong enough to exert significant power in its own neighborhood. So to put it succinctly, when the Cold War ended, Moscow genuinely wanted good relations with the West, but only on terms acceptable to a Russian elite that had grown up when their country was still a superpower. And most Western leaders and decision makers genuinely wanted good relations with Russia, but they wanted good relations with an imaginary Russia rather than the highly imperfect one that was actually on offer. It's hard to remember now, but in 1994, Russian President Boris Yeltsin was already warning of a cold peace, just 3 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the West, we tend to think of Yeltsin as a democratizer and Putin as an autocrat, which makes the former president good and the latter bad. But the reality is that even the most pro-Western officials in Russia during Yeltsin's time in power were very unfavorable to the idea of NATO expansion. At a time when no one was threatening anyone, NATO was admitting new member states who, quite reasonably, wanted an insurance policy that Russia would never occupy them again. At a time when we were supposed to be building a Europe whole and free, or as Gorbachev called it, a common European home, we were instead building a European security order that effectively excluded one of the continent's most powerful states. We did not overcome the dividing lines of the Cold War. Rather, the dividing line simply moved further east. We conveniently ignored the fact as well that even under Yeltsin, Russia did not abandon its pretension to being a great power with independent interests, and that his acceptance of much of the Western agenda was in part a matter of necessity rather than conviction, given the dire economic straits his country found itself in the 1990s. In fact, many in the West thought that preserving Yeltsin's hold on power was synonymous with Russia's continued democratization. And this allowed us to turn a blind eye to his imposition of a presidentialized constitution by force, a development that ultimately laid the groundwork for his successor, Putin, to construct an increasingly authoritarian political system. So now, having covered the question of European institutions, let's briefly discuss principles. One of the unfortunate realities of the European Security Order is that the principles that it explicitly endorses are in tension with one another. For example, state sovereignty and human rights can be in tension with one another. The territorial integrity of states and the right to self-determination of nations can also be in tension with one another. The 1990 Charter of Paris, which was the document that signaled the end of the Cold War and proclaimed the establishment of a new Europe, that document featured another tension. On the one hand, the Paris Charter endorsed the idea that states should have the right to choose their own security partners, but at the same time, it also endorsed the concept of indivisible security, the notion that no state should take measures to increase its own security at the expense of another state's security. So right away, you can see the tension here. For example, if Ukraine wants to choose NATO as its security partner and as its ally, then it should be free to do so, according to the Paris Charter. But at the same time, if Russia sees Ukraine's NATO membership as a threat to its security, it's not easy to see how these two principles can be reconciled. So what we ended up with, due to a combination of hubris of all sides and bureaucratic inertia, was Russian and Western diplomats and decision makers spending years citing principles, rules, and pent-up grievances at one another rather than actually talking to each other. And it should be evident to anyone that talking past one another is not a recipe for ensuring peace and security, and that an inability to resolve disagreements diplomatically, especially when perceived vital interests are at stake, will only encourage countries to resolve those disagreements through much less pleasant means. In the lead up to the 2013-2014 Euromaidan crisis in Ukraine, both Russia and Western institutions were framing the debate increasingly in zero-sum terms. Moscow was encouraging Kyiv to join its Eurasian Customs Union, and by its very nature, agreeing to a common external tariff with Russia would have prevented Ukraine from signing a free trade agreement with the EU, hence the zero-sum nature of that demand. Meanwhile, NATO and EU leaders were insisting that Ukraine had the right to choose whether to pursue a Western or Russian future, and no serious efforts were undertaken to reconcile the EU's proposed association agreement for Ukraine with Russia's Eurasian Customs Union. Framing this as a binary choice, especially for a country that had strong economic and people-to-people links with both Russia and the West, was entirely unnecessary and counterproductive. Now, under normal circumstances, the purpose of a security order is to enhance everyone's security. It is supposed to be designed to make conflict less likely, by definition. But when it comes to both its institutions and its formally agreed upon principles in its foundational documents, the way the post-Cold War European security order was set up appears to have actually made things worse. And so going forward, in my view, there are at least 3 lessons we're going to have to take away from these 3 decades of failure to build a shared security system for Europe. So first of all, lesson number 1, we need to talk. All too often, we proclaimed that there could be no business as usual so long as our counterparts' behavior was not meeting our expectations. And this attitude only moved us further and further down the path to eventual war. Dialogue should not be viewed and must not be viewed as a reward for good behavior or something to be withheld in the case of bad behavior. In fact, withholding dialogue only breeds resentment on the part of our counterparts for having not been treated as an equal, which perversely makes conflict more likely. Simply put, refusing to talk is counterproductive. We need to rediscover the value of diplomacy. And by this, I mean genuine diplomacy, where we actually talk to each other, and not so-called public diplomacy, where our goal is to posture in front of the rest of the world. Second, given that some of the institutions of the post-Cold War European order failed to prevent war, this may be a sacred cow that I'm challenging here, but we should consider whether new institutions or bodies will be necessary going forward. In the post-Cold War era, we had NATO, we had the EU, we had the OSCE, and eventually the NATO-Russia Council. But the question is, do we need nimbler, less rigid, and less public-facing bodies to facilitate mutual understanding and make conflict less likely. The Quincy Institute's Better Order Project, which is a report developed and endorsed by more than 100 leading experts and former statesmen from across the world, answers this question decisively in the affirmative. And we propose the creation of a new crisis consultation mechanism for Europe to game out crises before they happen and either help to avert them or at least attenuate their consequences should they erupt. In short, in this case, we need to rediscover the value of cooperative rather than zero-sum security. And to facilitate such cooperation, we need new minilateral fora to guide us through today's period of global change and uncertainty, which has all too often produced gridlock in established multilateral bodies such as the United Nations. Finally, an order that does not grant legitimacy to the declared security interests of all major stakeholders will ultimately result in security for none of them. Neither Russia, nor Ukraine, nor the West is more secure as a result of 3 years of war and escalating tit-for-tat threats. Dismissing one another's security concerns is not a recipe for peace, but that's precisely what has happened on all sides over the past many years. Russia's stated concerns that it was being excluded from the core of Europe's security order and that NATO's expansion posed a security threat were considered unfounded, and explicitly so, by the West. And the concerns of Central and Eastern European states that Russia posed a threat to their security led to accusations of Russophobia on Moscow's part. What we need here is to rediscover the value of strategic empathy, to see the world through the eyes of others, strategic empathy. And that means finding ways to build at least aspects of a continental security order with the Russia that actually exists rather than the one we wish we had. Failure to do so would mean that America will be continually pulled back into ever-escalating tensions in Europe at the expense of other equally pressing foreign policy goals around the world. So, diplomacy, cooperative security, and strategic empathy. These are the things that we will need not only to build a more stable Europe, but also a more stable world. And these are the ideas that lie at the core of our Institute's Better Order project. As the world becomes less and less unipolar, the United States won't be able to set the terms of the international order unilaterally. Once other countries become powerful enough to do to America what America has for the past 30 years been powerful enough to do to them, the United States will need institutions and cooperation, norms and laws to ensure its own security. And it will need strategic empathy to navigate a world of different powers, different interests, and different cultural worldviews. If not, then the world we will inhabit on the other side of today's period of change will be one in which America will be less secure. The slow-moving collapse of the post-Cold War European security order owed itself to no small extent to defective features that were present at its creation. As we now embark on the daunting task of building a global order fit for a diffuse and diverse world, we must avoid repeating those same mistakes. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Wow. What a very enlightening, thought-provoking, and stimulating address was just delivered by Dr. Zachary Paikin. We are very much looking forward to questions from the audience and would like people who would like to ask questions to queue up along the ramps here on my left and on my right. There are microphones at the bottom of the ramps. There's one there and there's one here. Come on up and let's ask Dr. Paikin some questions, please. You're the first one of many.
Fantastic question. Thanks so much. My own view on this issue is that at the fall of communism in Russia, Russia was effectively directionless. It did not really have a strong sense of what it wanted, besides wanting to effectively return to Europe to join the West, and was therefore in a very vulnerable position and very much subject to what Western countries were prepared to dictate, and very much open to pursuing what was then known as shock therapy. There were folks in Russia that were, very deeply, including Yegor Gaidar, served as finance minister at the time, who believed as a matter of conviction that this is something that Russia should pursue, even though there would be great pain at the time. But by and large, the Cold War ended at a moment where Western relative influence was comparatively high, and Russia's had effectively collapsed in comparison to that. It raises the interesting question, of course, about if a similar thing were to happen today, if we were to see regime change in Russia today, and I'm not predicting that we will, but if we were, would Russians, both the Russian elite and the Russian population, look to the West for guidance to the same extent as they did in the late 80s and throughout the 90s? And my answer is probably no. But at that time, it was very much a time when Russia was open to pursuing the sorts of reforms that Western technocrats and leaders were encouraging it to perform. This was a time that we were, presumed to be the end of history, and that the Western model had been vindicated, and therefore this is the economic path that they were going to pursue. The only issue here is that they were less subject to international economic assistance than countries that eventually ended up joining the European Union, like Poland. And this left Russia in a very difficult position throughout the 1990s. Ordinary Russians lost about 5 years off their life expectancy. The country literally began to fall apart, and there was a war in Chechnya, of course. Their president was viewed as a laughingstock and a drunk on the international stage. And so, many people in the West remember the 90s as a time of optimistic potential democratization in Russia, but that's not how ordinary Russians remember the 90s at all. And so most of them see Putin as someone who restored territorial integrity, stability, economic growth, and dignity and respect for Russia on the international stage, Russian power as well, of course. Putin has, for very good reason, for his own domestic narrative of legitimacy, positioned himself alongside other historical Russian leaders who have underlined the importance of centralized state power rather than decentralization. So that's what Russia was looking at the time. It was, a case of conviction for, the technocratic elite that were very much committed to this westernization. But it was westernization within limits, right? So there was economic westernization, but it was not geopolitical westernization per se, right? This was a Russian elite that was still ultimately committed to preserving Russia's status as a great power. And so we probably mistook this desire that Russia wanted economic reform to look like more of a Western model at the time.
Wanted to interpret it the way
We wanted to interpret it precisely, as a full-fledged political Westernization. And we made, by the way, the same mistake as it relates to China. We thought that economic liberalization there would lead to political liberalization, which it didn't. And I think that's an important lesson for us to remember going forward, that, there may be actors around the world that see the benefits of globalization, but that doesn't mean that they're prepared to abandon their own unique interests and culture. And it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that they're prepared to adopt our model across the board either. What the Cold War was a standoff between communism and capitalism. And that's very different from saying that it was a standoff between democracy and authoritarianism. And what was vindicated by the end of the Cold War, and the result of the end of the Cold War, was capitalism. And so the rest of the world said, great, capitalism is now the model for global development. We want more of that. Let's do capitalism. We could do capitalism in different ways. There could be state-driven capitalism, but by and large, we now believe in markets as the final form of development. But that doesn't mean that we're prepared to embrace Western-style liberal democracy in ways that is seen as eroding our domestic regime in stability, our core values, et cetera. So that's one thing that we read into a little bit too much, I would think. But Russia did want to pursue those reforms, and they did want to pursue as well, of course, deep economic links with the West. But this is another thing that we see across centuries of Russian history, which is that in all the times that Russia has had westernizing leaders who wanted to pursue reforms and ties with the West, including most famously Peter the Great, they wanted to do so in order to strengthen their own national capabilities and national power. So it wasn't economic westernization, again, to abandon its own independent status, but rather we want Western investment, we want Western technology, et cetera, so that we can be a strong power in our own right. And that's something that, again, we misinterpreted. Too many of us in the West, particularly in Germany with their famous Wandel durch Handel philosophy, which means change through trade, that if we trade more and more with Russia, we're going to change Russia effectively. That was mistaken. Russia was all too happy to develop deep ties with the West and believed that that would make them a part of Europe. But that doesn't mean that Russia would fundamentally change from being an independent great power.
Do you think there is any real diplomatic process going on now to settle the Ukraine war, other than what we see as a total unsuccess in the newspaper? And then I guess my question is, why is it there's only three major players, at least from what I see, in trying to settle the Ukraine war, and that's NATO, with mainly being the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine? Aren't there other forces that might be more successful working out a real diplomatic solution?
Absolutely. So for starters, let me answer the first part of your question first, which is, are we seeing a real diplomatic process? The answer is yes, we're seeing a real diplomatic process that's being undertaken in earnest, but we're not seeing a tremendous amount of success just yet. There has been one big success, which is that the Trump administration has succeeded in getting the Russians to engage. And that was not evident that we could necessarily do that so easily. One of the big questions that we've been posing ourselves in the West since the start of the war is, what leverage do we have over the Russians to actually get them to engage, to convince them to engage, rather than for them to view that their interests actually lie in continuing the fight. And we've whet their appetite enough to get them to come to the table. But my own view here is that the administration since then has probably been going about this the wrong way. What Russia wants, and has communicated very clearly what it wants, is a political settlement of the conflict, which leads to some kind of a revision of the European security order. In other words, some kind of a grand bargain with the West. And the approach that the Trump administration has taken so far is to focus on getting a ceasefire first, and just a pure ceasefire, which Russia does not have an incentive to agree to, given that it feels like it's making gains on the battlefield right now, and that such a ceasefire could be used as an opportunity by the Ukrainians to gain a reprieve and to rearm, to mobilize, etc. And so, unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be the right approach. Henry Kissinger also used to say that expanding the table, the negotiating table in terms of issues, is actually a helpful way to proceed with negotiations. Because if you're only dealing with one issue, which is a ceasefire, how do we get you to stop fighting right now, then both sides can have very entrenched positions. But if you are open all of a sudden to talking about a much greater range of issues related to the future of the European security order more broadly, which includes not just the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, but the relationship between Russia and NATO and the West, then perhaps if I'm willing to compromise here and to offer you something here, Russia would be willing to compromise on something over there. Yet that's not the approach we've taken so far. So that's something that I think will have to change. And this segues into the second part of your question, which is what's going to happen what needs to happen for that to happen is we need to indeed see the interests of other players taken into account as well, specifically the Europeans, who've been basically shut out of this process from the beginning of the Trump administration's outreach to both Ukraine and Russia. And that's not helpful either. Now, obviously, it makes perfect sense for the Trump administration to have begun this process by reaching out to Russia. That I fully endorse. Because if you start by trying to rally allied support, well, you've got 27 different positions within the EU, some of whom are very hostile to Russia and opposed to any dialogue whatsoever. You've got the British as well. So coordinating all of those countries into a common position first was not, would not have been a wise move, and the Trump administration was right to send a message very clearly to the Europeans that they do not have a veto over the Trump administration's desire to pursue settlement talks with the Russians. But now that those talks with the Russians and the Ukrainians are underway, we have to acknowledge that Europe is going to be an integral part of the solution, and they have the ability to scuttle this process if they want, and that's what they've been doing so far. So they very much need to be at the table when it comes to major issues like Ukraine's future in the European Union. That's something that we should try to get all actors here to endorse, including Russia. That would be a major victory for Ukraine, which indeed was not even envisaged prior to the start of this war. We forget this, but Ukraine was not a candidate country to join the European Union before this war, and it was not clear where the borders of Europe would start, but would stop rather. But from Brussels' perspective, Ukraine was very much othered, almost as much as Russia was. And any membership, in the EU for Ukraine, if it was to be entertained at all, was something that was explicitly said to be 20, 25 years in the future. But the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a fundamental shift of the discourse in Europe, which is Ukraine is us. And that's a hugely important victory for Ukraine. They may not retain 100% of their territorial integrity, but nonetheless, it should be possible to envisage, a grand bargain compromise that gives Ukraine quite a great deal of what it is seeking here, which includes a major Western future for it as a Western-oriented, increasingly developed democracy with strong ties to institutions like the EU and eventual membership, while simultaneously providing sanctions relief that can help to fuel, in effect, Ukraine's reconstruction and compensation for Ukraine for Russia's illegal invasion. So these are the types of grand bargains that we need to start considering, that we have not, done so until now because of the taboo on wanting to talk with Russia. But absolutely, the Europeans have to be at the table. There are other actors around the world as well who have a stake in the outcome of this conflict, but they haven't really been willing to exert all that much leverage in this process so far. They've been more content to sit on the sidelines, which I think is unfortunate, but they will potentially be important components of a solution once the Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, and Russians have agreed on a few things amongst themselves. So, for example, if they agree on a peacekeeping mission as being a necessary component of enforcing a ceasefire, then many of these countries, for example, China, other countries from the global south, these may be countries that we should go and seek to provide peacekeepers, because Russia has, since its isolation from the West over the past 3 years, developed deeper and deeper ties with these countries, with China, with the global south. And if you bring peacekeepers from those countries, or if you bring Chinese investment into Ukraine to help rebuild Ukraine, you're giving the Russians a very strong disincentive from invading again, because it wouldn't want to upset those relationships that it has really put a lot of effort into deepening over the past 3 years.
Got my question. Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the global south, because my question revolves around that, about the role of diplomacy in rebuilding security in Europe. And I'd like you to comment on Russia's willingness to increase allies in the global south through BRICS and their economic gains that can occur from that. Thank you.
Thank you. So the BRICS is a very diverse grouping, and it's expanding right now, but you've got countries within it like Russia that have had much more of an anti-Western disposition in recent years, but you've also got other countries like Brazil and India that are democracies and that enjoy very good relations with the West. So because of this disagreement between different member states, within the BRICS, there is no consensus on turning the BRICS into some kind of anti-Western organization. And so, to answer your question there, this shows that Russia views this organization as useful, but ultimately it's not going to be a vehicle for it to oppose the West more significantly. As for economic ties, this is an important dimension of Russia's foreign policy, but the political aspect of it for Russia is what it considers to be the most important, because it allows it to claim that there's an increasingly post-Western international order that's in the process of construction. And most members of BRICS are absolutely adamant in saying that this is supposed to be complementary to the United Nations and complementary to the existing multilateral structures and complementary to the current international order, and not meant to challenge it in any way. And so we should be careful not to overinterpret developments in the West here, and we should try to engage with BRICS as much as we can. But there's no question that it's an important economic vehicle for other countries as well. It has been a lifeline, of course, not just BRICS as an institution, but deepening ties with China in particular and with other countries as well has been a hugely important economic lifeline for Russia throughout this war to weather, the international sanctions campaign, which is really mostly a Western sanctions campaign against Russia. And I think that just goes to show that we live in an integrated global economy. We live in a multipolar world. And as a result of that, it really is impossible to isolate a great power from obtaining the economic resources and also the technological resources it needs to be able to wage a war when its core interests or its perceived core interests are at stake. So our campaign has really been aimed at trying to isolate Russia, but we haven't done that, in effect. We haven't done it successfully, and to the extent that we did do it successfully, the Trump administration has already removed the taboo now on talking to Russia. So we really need to keep that in mind going forward, that if we're entering, a more and more multipolar world, if that is indeed the correct frame of reference, we can't isolate anyone. It means we have to talk to everyone. It means we need to try to understand everyone. means we need to make certain compromises, not any compromise, but we need to make certain compromises in the name of ensuring international peace and security. But those compromises, of course, need to be in line with established international norms. So even if, for example, Ukraine ends up acknowledging that it is not going to be able to reclaim all of its territory by military force, that doesn't mean that we should be endorsing, by any stretch, Russia's annexations, which are illegal, of Ukrainian territory. We're simply going to have to agree to disagree on that front, perhaps come up with a formula to address it at some point in the distant future. But we have a model for this already from the Cold War. I mean, we forget that the Soviet Union annexed the 3 Baltic republics during the Second World War, and that those 3 countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, were independent during the interwar period. And for the most part, Western countries did not recognize the Soviet annexation of those 3 republics, nor of the northern and western parts of Belarus. So we have that precedent already where we can agree to disagree, but we can still maintain diplomatic links and pursue cooperation that can avert a global nuclear catastrophe. And we've not been doing that wisely over the past 3 years. We've had this prolonged period of just refusing to talk to each other, and not only refusing to talk to each other, but refusing also to compartmentalize issues related to arms control and nuclear weapons and strategic stability, which of course would be catastrophic if we have this tit-for-tat escalation in Ukraine, in which each side sees its red lines being constantly tested, and each side engages in actions in response to those challenging of red lines that leads to, we think, on each side, we're taking a logical step that, of course, the other side won't respond to what we're doing. But they do, and each time we think that the other side will not risk further escalation, but they do. And if you don't have those lines of communication established to avert a catastrophe, it could be a major problem. And both Russia and the West are guilty of this over the past 3 years, of refusing to talk at different points in time. At the beginning of the war, we refused to talk to Russia, and then after about a year later, Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor, proposed that actually we resume arms control agreements with Russia with no preconditions. But the Russians said, no, actually, we're going to tie this to the Ukraine issue. And that, has not really happened. And even during the Cold War, we never saw that happen. We saw the U.S. and the Soviets insulate and continue to pursue their arms control arrangements, despite myriad political disagreements and despite competing, vociferously in proxy conflicts around the world, right? So, the Cold War here, I think, offers not a perfect model, because we don't want to live in a world, again, of spheres of influence and the threat of nuclear annihilation. But nonetheless, it does show that you can conduct diplomacy with powers that you don't like in the pursuit of a more peaceful and stable world.
So I have a meta-observation and then a question. One is kind of the life lessons that there was 3 big takeaways I took from life lessons, nothing really to do with international, but the idea of talking is more likely to lead to a resolution than not talking. So anybody who's been married probably knows that, right? So I thought that was pretty cool. And then the observation you had of we viewed it the way we would interpret it versus what it might really be. And then the third you just got on was about how understanding and compromise are needed. So when I come to a talk like this, and I'm certainly no expert in international, I kind of try to take the meta stuff out that I can kind of apply to my life when I go home. The question was, especially because you're with the Quincy Institute and you've talked about this better order, which I've never heard about, if you could dive a little bit deeper into that, and either the framework or a little more of the specifics, and then, I don't know if you kind of a roadmap, how does this thing kind of possibly move forward? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the Better Order Project, and you're welcome to find out more about it by visiting betterorderproject.org. And in fact, our CEO has a few copies here, hard copies of our report, if you'd like to get your hands on some. But the impetus for this project was about a couple of years ago, in the middle of 2023, back when the Biden administration was still in office. Basically, the concern at the time was that the administration was focused, in terms of its own rhetoric, on advancing and defending the so-called rules-based international order. And that sounds all well and good from the average person's ears. To us, it sounds like that's a neutral description of the international order that has prevailed since the end of World War II. But it's also a deliberately opaque term, and it's designed to allow the United States and a coalition of the U.S. and its allies to, in effect, unilaterally decide what the rules are and to make themselves, to appoint themselves, indeed, as the unilateral arbiter of those rules. So to act outside the bounds of international law to protect this so-called rules-based system on behalf of everyone, right? So call it U.S. exemptionalism as opposed to U.S. exceptionalism. And we were concerned because, of course, if we don't strengthen and reinvigorate the multilateral institutions and the international legal regimes that, enjoy universal support and universal legitimacy that bring us all together, then we could end up in a situation where the leading powers of the world are constantly competing with one another over what the rules of the future should be. And I don't think that the administration at the time fully appreciated that fact, that they think that they were trying to defend the existing rules-based order, but really what they were doing is shaping a competition about what the future rules should be, and therefore leading to a likelihood in which there will be different sets of rules proffered by different countries, and that leads us into a multi-order world, which is not what we want, because that makes it much, much harder to agree on how we tackle major security challenges of the day, right? Whether it's traditional security challenges like arms control, et cetera, whether it's new issues like climate change, more transnational issues, we need to have common fora in order to address these issues. And common fora aren't the only solution. We are seeing, as I've mentioned before, minilateral, fora that are being pursued as well, which can be complementary to those multilateral fora. But ultimately, the multilateral fora need to be there, so that the majority of the world can have their say. What we saw around the world in response to this rules-based international order rhetoric coming out of Washington was much of the global south, much of the rest of the world recoiling and saying, no, that's not what we support. We support an international order based on international law and based on the centrality of the United Nations system. And so, because of this seeming discord and because of the risks over time of not addressing it, we decided to bring together this network of more than 130 leading experts and scholars, but also former diplomats, ambassadors, ministers of foreign affairs from more than 40 countries. So countries represented from the West, from the global South, from all P5 countries, and we brought them together over the course of a year, a little over a year actually, and in various different formats. We did so, sometimes in one-on-one interviews online, sometimes in, group discussions that took place virtually, but two major conferences also took place in person in Istanbul, where we were able to iron out gradually the text that we ended up publishing. And it was a major negotiation because the people that we brought on board were representative, in effect, of the political mainstreams of their respective countries. And we wanted to forge a genuine global compromise here. And we didn't necessarily know that we would get over the finish line. But we did. We managed to get something that everyone felt a great deal of ownership in, that they were prepared to sell in their own capitals, despite the fact that they're signing their names and adding their names to compromises that their capitals right now are not willing to sign up to. And these are people who are very well connected to centers of power in their own capitals and have their own reputations at stake here, and yet they were willing to do this. And so I think we've set a precedent that, where there's political will, there is a way. And we've been going around the world and going around America trying to push these ideas over the past several months since we published the report, and we found a lot of uptake. Various capitals are interested in some of the proposals we've developed, and less interested in other proposals, but we're spreading the word, we're getting those ideas out there, and when the time does come, when the political will is there to actually negotiate future characteristics of the international order, we're certainly hoping that by nurturing these relationships, they're going to say, hey, I read that report, a few months or a couple of years ago, and there's a good idea here in my back pocket that I can pull out during negotiations that could break a negotiating deadlock at a given point in time. So this is a long-term project for us. The future of the international order is going to remain a major issue for quite some time. But already from a conceptual perspective, what we're pushing here, I think, is just really key, which is you need to have a more inclusive international order if you're going to have a stable international order.
One more question. When you speak about Europe, which Europe is going to show up? NATO? The EU? Is there some other formation of it?
So you're probably referring to Henry Kissinger's famous quote, which is, when I want to call Europe, I pick up the phone, who do I call exactly? It's not very obvious. But the answer is all of these institutions are going to play an essential role in resolving the war in Ukraine. The EU is going to be essential because of the promise of eventual membership for Ukraine, which is a major way that President Zelensky or his successor perhaps will have to sell a peace deal to his own population in Ukraine. He is going to have to basically, make it clear to his population that what lies on the other side of this, eventual membership, is better than continuing to fight a war. And right now, there's a number of folks in Ukraine who are not yet convinced of that. They don't necessarily trust the West as a partner that's actually going to lead them to a better future on the other side of this. And so that aspect is going to be a huge part of this. The EU is also, good at spending money. That's what they do. And so, playing a major role in reconstruction of Ukraine, that's where that institution, the EU, is going to play a significant role as well. But NATO, of course, is going to have to be there as well when it comes to arms control negotiations with the Russians, which is going to be a major component of any peace deal as well. I mean, many of the demands that Russia made in its so-called draft security treaties in late 2021 dealt with turning back the clocks to 1997, to the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And so, yeah, NATO is going to play, is going to have to play a major role there, and this is an arms control process that might take several years. And then on top of that, there's also the OSCE that I mentioned, which right now is more or less moribund, but nonetheless needs to be there as a forum for future arms control agreements to be formally agreed and ratified. And if they're not necessarily discussed through the OSCE, they're often discussed in the context of the OSCE. That's how many of these treaties, for example, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, were ultimately agreed. So all of these institutions are going to play a role. We, in our report, also propose that there should be a new body created, not a fully fledged institution, but nonetheless a mechanism to facilitate other forms of dialogue, and we need to be creative about that. We need to be willing to challenge those sacred cows. No one is really willing to take this lesson away from the Ukraine war explicitly, because it's much easier just to point the finger at each other and to absolve ourselves for all blame. But the fact is that the institutions that were designed to manage the post-Cold War European security order failed to prevent war in Europe. And their job is to prevent war in Europe. They failed. And so some of these institutions are going to need to be reformed, but we may also need new institutions.
I just want to throw you a softball because following up on the prior question and on that one, the UN failed also, right? The Security Council has failed abysmally, and I just wanted to toss you a ball to say maybe you could make a little more explicit what the Better Order Project is focusing on, at least in that one specific example around the UN Security Council.
For sure. So yes, there's no question that the UN Security Council has failed to uphold its mandate in many respects. There's a big debate about what the mandate of the Security Council is. Some people will say that the mandate of the Security Council is to prevent great power war, and that's why the veto exists. Better to jaw than to war. And in that sense, it has succeeded in its mission, at least this far. But it has certainly failed to prevent conflict in many cases. You're seeing gridlock quite frequently, various sessions devolving into effectively shouting matches, and this is just not, what the institution is for. You're also seeing too many states no longer conduct diplomacy behind closed doors, and they're spending too much time focusing on their public-facing statements at the Security Council, which makes the proceedings of the Security Council last longer than they need to, but it also just leads to everyone, spending time on their official statements, not actually on conducting real diplomacy. So, there are many ways in which the Security Council is indeed failing to uphold core international norms and prevent conflict and to avoid impunity for leaders that do violate international humanitarian law. That being said, the United Nations still retains unparalleled legitimacy as the only fully inclusive forum, really, in the world. And so in this case, there really is no alternative but to try to reinvest in the United Nations, to reform it, to reinvigorate it in various different ways, so that so many of the countries in the world that feel as if they don't have enough of a stake and a say there actually get to see their ideas and their identities and their interests reflected much more in the United Nations. And just one example, 60% of the stuff on the agenda of the Security Council deals with Africa, given the conflicts there. And yet Africa only has 3 out of 15 seats, none of which are permanent. Meanwhile, NATO has 6 out of 15 seats de facto, 3 of which are permanent with a veto, despite the fact that that clearly does not represent neither the population distribution of the world nor even the economic distribution of the world any longer, right? And that disparity is only going to grow further as time goes on. So look, a slightly cynical read of this is that if we don't reform the Security Council, it will, still be there. It'll be a useful tool that the great powers might use from time to time when they want to use it, but they may not use it all the time. And indeed, for much of the history of the Cold War, a lot of great power diplomacy was conducted in the Security Council, but a lot of times they chose deliberately to bypass the Security Council when it was in their interest. So it's a tool, it's there, but the more central it is in the international order, in my view, the better it is for the international order. So it's never going to be perfect. And this is one thing that I think that we also have difficulty vocalizing in the West, which is that we believe that issues pertaining to international law, human rights, et cetera, are just a matter of legal regimes, and it's just a question of implementing them, and it's a very technical almost approach towards it. But the reality is rights are political, demands for rights are political, norms are political. You can't discuss questions of norms and rights without raising the question of whose norms, whose rights, who has the right to be heard. And so the corollary of that statement is that these institutions are always going to be imperfect. There are always going to be demands that aren't going to be heard. And nonetheless, that doesn't take away from the importance of these institutions. But the way that I like to think about international order is that international order is not purely the absence of conflict. And that's the approach that in the West we like to think of, especially with the end of history and in the post-Cold War era. We like to think of order as the absence of conflict. But my perspective is that order is actually the existence of predictable mechanisms to manage inevitable conflict. There's always going to be conflict because there's always going to be political demands. And there's always going to be disagreements about the norms and the principles and what they are at any given time. Because the norms that exist in any international order are going to be inherently ambiguous because they're going to be negotiated. And if they're negotiated, then we're going to have to come up with ambiguous diplomatic terminology that we can all live with, which in turn sets the groundwork for future conflict by definition. So you're always going to have conflict. You're always going to have contestation. The question is, can we make space in international institutions to have healthy disagreements and to resolve these conflicts through genuine diplomacy? And that's not what we've had over the past several years. There's been too much lecturing and not enough genuine diplomacy.
Thanks for that response, Dr. Paikin. I have one quick question. Any other questions from the audience? We'll take one more after mine if anyone would like. But going back to your description of Russia as feeling othered, as feeling as though its security interests were not legitimately regarded by the EU, by the world indeed, to what extent do you think that that's a valid argument, particularly when Russia is such a vast country? Number one, they have a nuclear arsenal that vastly outnumbers our own. Why should they be afraid of any country? And then number three, they also supply Europe with a good amount of its natural gas. How could it feel othered or made to feel inferior or afraid, given that it has so much power in those respects?
No, look, that's an excellent question, and many scholars, including Russian scholars, have made the argument that it shouldn't feel threatened any longer, that, for example, NATO expansion shouldn't be viewed as a threat because territorial strategic depth, having some kind of a buffer zone in Europe is no longer important in an era where we have intercontinental ballistic missiles. That takes away from sort of the necessity of having spheres of influence. But the way that I would put it is that, yes, there are security threats that are experienced in Moscow and indeed at any capital. And those security threats are genuinely perceived. But the bigger issue for Russia is a question of status rather than actual security threats. Less the question of NATO expansion and more the issue of NATO centrality in the first place in the post-Cold War order. That is to say that the leading security institutions, or what effectively became the leading political and security institutions in Europe after the Cold War, which are NATO and the EU, were bodies that did not include Russia and that Russia had no hope of ever joining. And so by definition, Russia was seen to be a second-tier actor whose interests could be, to a larger extent, disregarded in talks. And so when it came to Russia's perspective on, for example, Ukraine's role in the security order, and that NATO membership for Ukraine was not acceptable for Russia because, a whole number of reasons, the deep cultural links between Ukraine and Russia, the idea that this could eventually pose a security threat, the idea that it would lead to the final consolidation of all of the rest of Europe in one institution that still excludes Russia. All of that was largely disregarded. The official position of NATO and the EU was that Ukraine's membership in those bodies is purely a matter for NATO and the EU and Ukraine to discuss, and that no third country has the right to exercise a veto over that. Now that sounds like it's all well and good as a matter of principle, but of course if you're a country like Russia, the idea that you have no say over the security orientation of countries that are on your border, I don't think that that's a position that the United States would ever agree to, in any sort of negotiations. And so, basically repeatedly saying that, your security concerns are unfounded, especially when, NATO insisted that it was purely a defensive alliance, when in reality we saw it engage in offensive military action multiple times, perhaps for, reasons that were defensible, but nonetheless in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Libya, NATO member states acting outside of NATO in the case of Iraq. This did not, inspire much confidence in the Russians, effectively, that NATO was going to be an institution that had Russia's best interests at heart. And so there was this real desire, as I mentioned before during my talk, that Russia really wanted to join the West, not at any cost after the Cold War, but it wanted to join the West, but it feels as though it was shut out of the premier fora in the West. And the way I've heard someone put it one time is, if you, initially admire a club, but they won't let you become a member of that club, even if they let you into the bar and have soft drinks from time to time, but don't give you the rest of the privileges of being members of the club, you're not going to start liking that club over the long term, right? That club will look much less good in your eyes over time. So going back to the question that was raised about interpersonal relations and the relationship, with that and international relations, I think that there's a lot to be said for that a lot of the time. And that's why I mentioned during my talk that we need to rediscover strategic empathy. Humans are made to be empathetic to some significant extent. Well, there's a few things here. So you're referring to d'abord, merci beaucoup de votre question. The Euromaidan conflict, or revolution, excuse me, in 2013-14, was a genuine uprising that occurred in Ukraine, especially in Kiev, but throughout other parts of Ukraine as well. It had less support in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine than it had elsewhere, but it was genuine and from the ground up. There was this real sense that Yanukovych had made a major mistake in not agreeing to move forward with the association agreement with the European Union, which many, particularly young, well-connected, professional classes of Ukrainians, were quite concerned about, the fact that President Yanukovych had moved away from that agreement. Now, that being said, There's no question that the Yanukovych administration's response to the protests was heavy-handed, and that it did ultimately lead to a transfer of power in Ukraine through extra-constitutional means. And the way that we framed this in the West as being, purely the exercise of democracy within Ukraine, when in reality the transfer of power was extra-constitutional. And on top of that, the fact that there was an agreement, that all sides had reached, backed by Russia and the West, that there should be a transition of power, but an orderly transition of power, with early elections to be held in the fall of 2014. That ultimately didn't happen when Yanukovych was forced to step down immediately from power in February of 2014 and was forced to flee. And when that happened, rather than uphold the agreement, Western countries actually said, we actually support what's going on right now in Kiev. We support, this immediate transfer of power, and went back on their word, that they had agreed to in the initial agreement. This did not really raise a great deal of confidence in Moscow that the West could be trusted as an interlocutor. And of course, there are many reasons, as well, for the West to doubt Russia's sincerity and trustworthiness as an interlocutor as well. It went both ways. But nonetheless, the outcome of that process was the Minsk agreements, which were an attempt by Russia to continue engaging with the West. And Putin would not have engaged in the Normandy format in the Minsk process with France, with Germany. Initially, the contact group was with the US and the EU, plus Ukraine and Russia. But here, the format that eventually consolidated was with France and Germany taking the lead. Russia only agreed to that because, of course, Putin believed that a deal was indeed possible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have agreed to that in the first place. In fact, Putin had to fight off many much more nationalistic voices within the Russian government and within Russian society who were pushing for a much more militarized solution to the Ukraine crisis at the time. There's no doubt in my mind that Putin thought that a deal was still possible at that time. Now, was war inevitable as a result of what happened in 2014? As I've made clear during my remarks, I think that the potential for conflict was baked in from the beginning of the post-Cold War European security order, and what institutions we chose to manage that order and how those institutions evolved very early on in the 1990s. It was clear that we were set up for some kind of clash. Did it have to be Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Not necessarily, but the fact that we were constantly talking past each other was certainly not helpful. That said, it would, had there been political will to actually implement the Minsk agreements after 2014, 2015, we could have seen conflict averted. Unfortunately, the approach that we took in the West was to kind of communicate that Russia was more responsible for implementing the Minsk agreements than Ukraine was, which was not fully true. And we were not prepared really to exert the necessary political pressure on Ukraine to fully implement those agreements. And I understand why Ukraine didn't want to implement those agreements, because they weren't necessarily favorable to them, and it would have required a decentralization of power in Ukraine that would have de facto given Russia a veto over Ukraine's Western orientation. But what we saw over time as Western assistance for Ukraine grew and grew in the post-2014 and the post-Euromaidan context, is that the Ukrainians became more and more sure of themselves, and they became stronger. And they said, look, we agreed, to this process. We agreed to the Minsk Accords in 2014, 2015, because we were weak, and that's the only reason why we agreed to it. But now that we're stronger, we shouldn't have to implement them. Well, what the Russians were saying was, well, we agreed to all this set of status quo arrangements with the United States and with NATO in the 1990s because we were weak. And now we're stronger. We want to revise that deal too. So either, as we say, pacta sunt servanda, either deals must be observed, or if we don't, then, we have to renegotiate these things every time the balance of power changes, which is to some extent how the world works. So was war absolutely inevitable, from 2014 on? No, not precisely at that moment. I think it was later in the process, towards 2020, 2021, et cetera, when it became much clearer that we were on a pathway to war and that Putin had made up his mind. But it certainly would have been helpful, had we done other things earlier in the process. It especially would have been helpful if we had not agreed in 2008 to the infamous NATO Bucharest Declaration, which said that Ukraine will be one day, a member of NATO. But in the meantime, we're not going to do anything tangible to advance that process. So we're basically communicating to the Russians, we're going to antagonize you. We're going to say something that you don't like. We're going to threaten somewhere down the road at some undefined point to, evict your military forces from Ukrainian territory, specifically from Sevastopol and Crimea, which are key to Russia's southern defenses. But in the meantime, if you want to do something to prevent, all that from happening, we're not going to do anything about it because we're not bringing Ukraine into NATO. So that was not a smart decision. And continually saying that, to antagonize Russia continually without providing Ukraine with any concrete security guarantees really made things a heck of a lot worse. And had we not done that, I think it would have been more likely that we could have averted a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks again so much, Dr. Peikin, for your thoughtful and insightful address. We've all come away with something to think about, and we hope all of you will join us again in the future at our future presentations on global affairs. Have a wonderful evening. Dr. Peikin has to catch a train right now. He has a big presentation in front of 100 Austrian officials tomorrow. So, not all Austrian, but 100 VIPs. So we'll have to let you go. Thanks so much for attending. Great job. Appreciate it.